What's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you've had a fantastic few days. It's been an interesting few days. The last time we spoke, a lot was up in the air, and there seems to be much more clarity now in terms of the outcome of the election. If you're like me, you've been on the edge of your seat, and maybe some of you still are, because we know that there are still legal battles playing out, and there are some questions about what the next couple months will bring. I think that it's certainly interesting to think about the future of democracy in the United States and elsewhere. We know that this will be a very different administration than the one that's now leaving. And I look forward to having conversations with you about all of these questions. I do want to kind of loosen up a little bit and kind of just chat about the election, about democracy, what thoughts you have. Before we do so, I want to share some good news. We finally secured a reader for this course, and so that's good news for you and good news for me. Um, it's now very likely that you'll have your grades within a week. You should have your exam grades by Wednesday or Thursday, and your paper grades, I think, in the next week or two, you should have. And so, very happy that we were able to finally get this set up. There were a lot of challenges because of COVID and because of the various things that fell through as a result of immigration policy and personnel and who could and could not work. So thank you very much for being patient. I realize how agonizing this has been. It was very difficult for me as well because I only found out that I didn't have TA support for this class well after the course actually began. And so I was never given an opportunity to design the course with the knowledge that I wouldn't have the TA that I was promised when I was hired. And so I apologize about this, but it is a situation that is improving, and I'm confident that we'll be in a much better position relatively soon because we now have someone who's going to be able to help us to manage the grading. So thank you very much for being patient, and I hope that you've hung in there and that you're remaining engaged in the class. I certainly continue to enjoy being here and working with you, even though it's been challenging often to kind of administer the course behind the scenes. So thank you again, and I appreciate it. Before we get started discussing and continuing to discuss democratic reversions, let's just take a moment and kind of talk about the election. I'm curious about what thoughts you have, how you feel about the process, what you think about the outcome. Whatever thought you have, let's engage that right now and have a discussion about it and just kind of get it all out on the table. You can use the mic. You can also use the chat. We'll incorporate your input however we can. What do you think?
I think one of the interesting things was how the world pretty much as a whole was celebrating when Donald Trump lost. There was stuff like fireworks in Paris and London. So it sort of demonstrates how much foreign displeasement with America was dependent on the president, because a lot of people just see Biden as not being Trump, therefore is much better for America's allies around the world. Even Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, was saying how he had a great relationship with the new president.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because remember that Trump advocated moving the capital of Israel to what, Jerusalem or something? I might be mistaken.
Yes, Jerusalem.
He advocated moving that, and I think that Netanyahu appeared to be supportive of that, and that was obviously very controversial for sacred and religious and cultural reasons. But Ishan's right. There's been kind of this like sigh of relief, in particular around like the possible reinsertion of the United States in the Paris Accord, the reinstatement of the Iran nuclear deal, changes in foreign policy that would be friendlier to allied nations, and just in general, a more cooperative relationship with old allies that increasingly we're moving away from the United States during the Trump era, which, by the way, hasn't come to an end. And this is part of what's interesting about the current moment as well. The fact that we now have a very angry, sort of lame duck president, if you will, who's got another couple months in office. And what he'll do during this couple months is anyone's guess. Look what he did during his administration before his potential reelection. And so those are all interesting points. It also raises the question of how the US will relate in kind of sync up with democracy around the world, and if the US will promote democracy, and if the United States' relationship with countries like Venezuela might change, or if their stance on issues like regime change in Venezuela or Guatemala, whether those issues might change. A lot of questions. What do the rest of you all think? I'm going to read some of these comments in the chat. If you want to make a comment using the mic, I encourage you to do that. Just speak up and I'll give you the floor, okay? And that's for anyone. Julissa says, with how everything has gone, I honestly thought Trump was going to win. I'm so relieved, such a great feeling. I'm going to be honest, me too. I won't pretend to not be a partisan. I don't consider myself a member of the Democratic Party. I have leanings that lie elsewhere, but I'm relieved with this outcome as well. And I think that it's a bit of a relief for democracy generally. And so that goes well beyond just the United States. Daisy said it was definitely a relief once they called it for Biden. Elaine agrees. John says, Israel already wants the world to recognize Jerusalem as their capital, if I recall correctly. Trump just moved the embassy from Tel Aviv. Okay, yeah, that's right. That's right. Arturo says, I feel that even though we know the results, the Trump administration is still using their power to try and shift the outcome of the election. Today, AG Barr sent a memo for the FBI to get involved. Yeah, absolutely, Arturo. And this brings to mind this kind of legal erosion that we associate with contemporary backsliding, where democratically elected officials and democratic decisions contribute to this dismantling of democracy. And in general, we know that this is the new face of democratic reversal. Military coups are not common anymore. It's much more likely that these decisions will be made under democratic auspices, enlisting the FBI to challenge the result, using the courts to try to overturn the result, and so on and so forth. Samantha says, I know that America's social status has been going down even before Trump, but it was kind of sad how even Canada didn't really like us at the time. I'm glad the work is welcoming us, especially with the Paris Treaty. Jocelyn says, do you think the US will go back into the JCPOA agreement? What's that, Jocelyn? Is that a trade agreement?
Yeah, so basically like during Trump's administration, on the JCPOA agreement basically states that Iran's not allowed to make like a certain amount of uranium or on nuclear weapons. But
the nuclear deal
from the statement.
Yeah, the nuclear deal. I certainly hope so. I think that the talk already is that they'll re-enter the nuclear deal, or at least Iran has been requesting that the deal be reinstated. And so because Biden has, President-elect Biden, that would be his decision. I think it's likely that you'll see that at least considered and almost certainly carried out, because that was a success of the Obama administration. And obviously Biden was vice president during the Obama administration and was part of that process. Juan says, low key, high key. Hillary called it. She said that Trump thinks everything is rigged against him. I mean, he even said that the Emmys were rigged because he didn't win. And this goes to the 2016 and 2020 elections where he said it's rigged. But like I said in POLI 190, there is a video of a Trump supporter that did voter fraud, so it's his own people who do the fraud. Julissa says, I think so, Jocelyn. Now that Trump is soon going to be out of the picture. I hope so, at least. Yeah, I hope that the Iran nuclear deal is reinstated as well. It was a good deal. It was achieved through endless negotiations. and brought adversarial powers together under a single agreement at a single table. And there was a lot of complaining about the fact that that deal involved returning money to Iran. That money, in fact, was Iran's money that had been essentially sequestered by the United States as part of the sort of hostile relationship that led up to the eventual breakdown that precipitated the agreement. And so that deal protected the world from nuclear annihilation, or at least kept us from getting one step closer to it. I think that it would be good for all of us to get back into it. And I think that obviously the Paris Treaty and the Paris Accord, obviously that's a good idea as well. Much of these changes, I think, were motivated by Trump's despising Obama. And that's really a poor reason to change policy. But luckily, or unluckily, depending upon your point of view, these changes can be relatively easily reversed and we can return to the status quo because, in fact, so much of Trump's agenda was just executive orders. That's the thing. He had like one legislative accomplishment, and that was the tax cuts for the rich. Everything else he did with executive actions. And so leaves you quite vulnerable when you get replaced by someone who defeated you, partly based on a campaign of promises to return to the status quo at a minimum and really improve conditions for working people and minorities, and a whole bunch of other groups who came out in large numbers for the Democrats under this election. Other ideas. Arturo says the Trump administration is not giving Biden the $9.9 million to get his transition team ready. I hadn't seen that. So that's interesting. So there's public money that's set aside for the purposes of the transition, and this is supposed to be, well, that's something. I think that has to be illegal, right? Another interesting thing is that Trump apparently came out and said that he has conditions, that he'll leave power only under certain conditions. Well, what do we know about that? Well, it's not an authoritarian regime, right? This is a democratic political system, and he doesn't have any power to do that. The Constitution remains intact, and it says that he has to go on January 20th, period. And, depending upon what you feel and how you feel about it, we can dance on his grave and enjoy it. And it doesn't require us to let him force the new administration to concede to certain conditions. It's just the way it is. And so, but Juan, he doesn't have to concede. He just doesn't. Even if he doesn't concede, it's not relevant. The inauguration of a new administration does not require a concession from the previous one. The Constitution says that on January 20th, his administration comes to an end. And if he doesn't leave, he becomes a trespasser. And the Secret Service and the military are perfectly capable of escorting him out of the building. And so regardless of whether he concedes or not, it's over. And he can be a sore loser and not concede, but it's not relevant to the eventual transition. Daisy says, it's crazy how he's the president, yet he doesn't know much about our government. Yeah, I agree. I don't think he knows anything about it. Arturo says he fired a secretary today that did not want to authorize troops to be on our streets. There were some rumors that he might be looking into a martial law status to keep power. Interesting. I hadn't heard that. Evan says, I believe the U.S. Secret Service already has a plan to escort him out in place if he refuses. Anyway, that's what I read. That's right. Yeah, I think that the more likely scenario is that he'll just get walked out kicking and screaming. And I hope everyone, look, even if you like Trump, let's admit that would be entertaining to watch. Come on. Who doesn't want to watch the Orange Menace get carted out of the White House? That sounds fascinating. Pull up a chair. Get the popcorn ready. And I would watch that over and over again. If I had that footage, I would just wake up every day and I would watch that. Yoel says, I'll be honest, I don't believe a Biden victory would come into fruition. I didn't believe. I celebrate the Trump downfall, though a Biden presidency would still be questionable. But nothing is more satisfying than to be alive for an unpopular one-term president. There's still a lot more to be done, and hopefully with more leverage. Yeah, I agree, Yoel. Look, I don't love Biden. I'm not thrilled about him. In fact, I don't like him. I don't think he's great. But you know what? This is his moment, and I'll support him. And he'll do, I think, a good job of trying to unify the country and heal these wounds. How he'll govern it may be a separate question. He's got the credit card companies in his back pocket, and they have him in his back pocket, their back pocket. And those are unfortunate realities. But he's not Donald Trump. And that is one thing that sets him apart from Donald Trump. He also doesn't owe Russia $421 million, also notable. But this is a moment that we can celebrate, if only because we're now watching the ouster of a one-term president. And that's so satisfying. Arturo says, right to prison. Yeah, I'm hoping they indict him and his whole family the day that he leaves office. Daisy says they'd better live stream it. Agreed. And they better make sure that there's no lagging, right? Everyone agrees. Arturo says, would a US president keep their Secret Service detail if they go to prison? No, because he won't be the president anymore. I mean, he might have some security, I guess. But I think technically he would have to have private security at that point. He becomes a citizen. He becomes a private citizen. And so he literally just loses all power at that moment.
Wait, so when he does eventually like come January 20th and like, yay, he's gone. How will the charges go for a lot of the stuff that he's been tried on like during his presidency with like the impeachment trials and stuff and like literally any other legal issue that he's been had? Will that have any bearing on like whether on like would his presidency status have any bearing on like the multitude of his legal troubles?
So the impeachment issue has been settled, and that was decided by the Senate. But there are a whole bunch of potential charges that can stem from his abuse of office, in particular, accepting gifts or money from foreign governments, to, I think, corruption-related charges that could be pinned. There are a whole set of issues that can be brought up once he becomes a private citizen. He does enjoy immunity as the president, and he can't be held accountable for the impeachment-related issues because that's a political process. But everything else is fair game. Once he loses that immunity, he can be tried and he can be indicted. And so it's very likely that he will be. The Southern District of New York, for example, there's some word that they might be preparing indictments. Santiago says, I'm glad that with Trump leaving, his policy on child separation at the southern border will also be gone. And hopefully those separated families can finally be reunited. Yeah, no kidding, Santiago. And that's one of the biggest blights on the entire country after this process. And in fact, it's been said already by more than one commenter that the United States needs a truth and reconciliation process after the Trump administration because of these questions of child separation, because of some of the abuses committed by the administration. I think that that's an idea worth considering. And the child separation policy is just so ghastly. To this day, I can't forget the images in the footage from inside those concentration camps where scores of people were huddled as masses with nothing, and delirious and confused and separated from their children and from their parents. That's a stain on the United States, as it should be. And anyone who says that that's a policy of the Obama administration is not telling the full truth. The Obama administration separated children from their families only if they could not verify that the parents were the actual parents of the child. And so in very few cases did they do that. The Trump administration changed the policy with a memo that required all families to be separated, regardless of whether or not, and especially if the parents could prove that they were the actual parents of the children. Daniela says, we better bully the president into going through with his plans. It's going to be tough, though. Evan says, it'll be nice to have a president who actually will take COVID seriously, too. Although I regret to inform you that we might not see an economic stimulus because that requires the approval of the Senate. And now that there's no new re-election in sight, they don't have any incentive to cooperate with Biden on that issue. Pretty sobering, pretty unfortunate. We'll see what happens. My take is that I think that Nancy Pelosi erred when she refused to cooperate and go along with Senate Republicans and Trump, who wanted an economic stimulus right before the election. That was a political decision that she made. She thought that that would be harmful to Democrats electorally. Turns out Trump lost, and I don't think that that stimulus would have helped him. And so that's now gone. We won't see that stimulus. Just unfortunate, it's gone with the wind. Daniela says Democrats barely gained anything in Senate, although the Georgia runoffs could still tilt the balance of power. Yeah, as Daniela correctly points out in a comment below. Arturo says, hopefully Biden sends real aid to Puerto Rico and considers sending help to places like Honduras that are being hit by hurricanes. Recent one was ETA. Juan says, I mean, a lot of college students didn't even get the first stimulus. Yeah, and that's an absolute disgrace, isn't it, Juan? Jocelyn says, Trump's tax policy has me dead. Yeah, no kidding. It's tax cuts for the rich. Take from the poor, give to the rich. Reverse Robin Hood. Daniela says, we're so behind on anything stimulus related compared to like every other nation in the world right now. I know, it's absolutely laughable. Evan says, true, the Georgia runoff could result in a 50-50 Senate. Yeah, and I think in which case the deciding vote goes to what? The vice president, if I'm not mistaken? And I wonder how that's going to go. Juan says, Trump's tax policy tax more than Biden's? Like what? Trump's tax policy tax more than? Are you thinking Trump? I'm a little confused by your comment, Juan. Daniela says, don't forget the Supreme Court and the 6-3 majority. Yeah, and they can certainly legislate from the bench, and they sometimes do. But the dynamics of the executive judicial relation will change too. Remember that they won't have the same level of popular support simply because, or the same level of institutional support because the president is not Donald Trump. And so I think that changes things a little bit. We'll have to see. Yeah, as Daniela points out, it's going to be hard for Biden to pass anything now. Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of. It's going to be a situation where we'll probably witness that peril of presidentialism that Juan Lenz wrote about when he said that the directly independently elected executive and legislature in a presidential democracy are likely to butt heads. We'll probably see that without a doubt, and it'll be difficult to govern. I'm so curious as how do you think a red state like Florida managed to pass a $15 minimum wage? Two reasons. First of all, it's barely a red state anymore. It's almost a swing state. A lot of Democrats, a lot of independents who will vote with Democrats. Second of all, there are a lot of poor people in Florida. And that means that even those poor people who vote for Trump probably depend on minimum wage. And so they're likely to vote in favor of minimum wage. Arturo says Trump has a policy that will increase taxes by 2021 to those that make less than what I believe was $80,000. Yeah, that's right. There's sort of that sort of like sunsetter provision in that policy that requires taxes to come up over time. Evan says SCOTUS cares a lot about their legitimacy. Going against a new president hurts that. Yeah, that was my point about the dynamics of the executive judicial relationship. And Jocelyn agrees. Daisy says, isn't it 75,000 to Arturo? Daniela says, California is socially liberal, fiscally conservative, voted against rent control and affirmative action. And I think, moreover, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't the decision about whether or not Uber could make drivers contractors or not, didn't that decision also basically work in favor of Uber as well and kind of against the interests of the drivers? I didn't pay a lot of attention to it, I admit, but I got the sense that that was also sort of like a fiscally conservative decision.
Relating to Prop 22, it was pretty much $200 million worth of the big Uber, Lyft, DoorDash companies spending money to sort of lock in the independent contractors, and it requires a 7/8 majority in order to change the law, which is absurd even by American filibuster standards.
And even with that, I know I saw somewhere that they were spending like upwards of like 100 and something million and in terms of like advertising from like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash. Like I know whenever I would go onto my phone and look up to like if I was like calling an Uber or like ordering food, the first thing I would see is a little yes on Prop 22. Imagine if they use that actual money to like give their workers like the benefits that they need, because a lot of these workers, they're like their lives are being very severely impacted by the stuff that's going on with Uber. And they're not receiving like any of the benefits that say an actual employee would of a company would, because they're being deemed as independent contractors. I know I saw an article from like the LA Times that said like that I was talking about a family of a person who's their main breadwinner ended up dying of COVID that he contracted while on his job as an Uber driver, and he wasn't eligible to any state benefits for the family because the company classified him as a contractor as opposed to a worker, opposed to an employee. And that was talking about Prop 22 would basically like seal the deal on like not letting them have any of those benefits.
Yeah, unfortunate. And I agree with Daniela. There's such a investment in preventing those benefits that you wonder if that money could have just simply been used to provide the benefits, right? And it's an issue that I unfortunately don't understand well enough. I fully admit, but you are all very engaged, and I like to see that.
Can I talk for a second? I don't know how to raise my hand. I'm sorry.
Oh no, please go ahead and speak. It's all yours.
I think a lot of the California propositions were rephrased in manners that it was kind of hard unless you like did your research on them. Because there was like for instance, yeah, like Prop 22, it was advertised a lot for people to believe that it was a good thing to do, but on the contrary, it ends up harming people. But there's also a lot of propositions in California that were supposed to be harmful, like I don't exactly remember, but the affirmative action one, basically, they tried to they try to cancel out the affirmative action and try to put something new in place, but they didn't actually necessarily say what they wanted to put new in place. So I just feel like California did a really bad job in trying to explain the propositions this year around.
Yeah, I always thought it was a travesty that California struck down affirmative action via a ballot measure, a proposition. It was a decision that was made, and I just always wondered why, because it seemed inconsistent with the values of the place. But sometimes California surprises you, and yet again, as is pointed out by Arturo, California voted no on affirmative action. And as Daniela points out, California propositions are inherently classist when you think about it. Well, yeah, because typically look who's able to mobilize, support, and invest enough to actually engage that process. People with resources, right? People who can often self-provide, or who have an interest, or who are well organized already. And so oftentimes I think those propositions become reflections of the groups who push for them, right? Or who are able to push for them. And so inevitably they kind of have like this sort of elitist tone. And what's ironic is that they're supposed to be a reflection of direct democracy, right? Ballot measures are supposed to be as democratic as you can get, small d democratic. But in reality, it's not really like that in California.
I know for a lot of the ever since I was young, I know my mom, she's an immigrant, moved to the States, like English is her second language. I know every time he's leaving.
I'm getting some water, sorry.
Okay, sorry. I was gonna say, ever since she was like first starting to vote, like I would always be having to help her like understand these like propositions, because the way that these people they're worded, when you think about it, there are a lot of people that don't have like the education needed to understand the proposition. So a lot of the times they'll go with with like what they see in the ads, and then you have people like Uber and stuff buying out the ads, trying to get you to think that, oh, this is going to benefit you, when in reality it's just putting more money in their pockets, and like essentially like screwing over like the lower and middle income, basically the working class of California. And when you think about it, it's just California is basically just like, with these propositions, is basically just like a rich person's playground to like do what they want with with legislature. Like we saw with Uber Prop 22, and like how all these like rich companies basically like bought out a proposition vote.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It gets me heated because it's like, it's supposed to be democracy, but in reality, it's just really only benefiting towards the people who like actually are able to get any understanding of the resources. And like, it's not like, you see a lot of resources for like understanding like presidents and candidates and like Senate and stuff, but there isn't really always much for the propositions. There should be more education related to these propositions that are like going to impact our lives.
Yeah, and one perspective out there is that propositions in direct democracy have broken California. That the system is out of control, and that it's too popular in a sense, in that popular process has been captured by these big interests who can invest the time and the money to get these propositions on the ballot, get the signatures, et cetera. For example, the effort years and years ago to strike down gay marriage, and who fronted that and who pushed for that? Well-organized and well-heeled religious organizations above all. And so that's just one example. But California is unique because other states don't have, not all states, or I don't know how many others have a system like this, but California stands on its own with how frequently and how common the propositions are. And I agree with you all that the system needs to be kind of fixed in a way, because it's too segmented and classist and elitist, even in the way that it's supposed to be more popular. I'll read two more comments here, and then we'll begin our lecture and continue discussing democratic reversals. Gustavo says, the fact that there needs to be a law in place as an incentive for companies, et cetera, to be more diverse just shows how much more work there needs to be done within California. Yeah, no kidding. Especially considering that 42% of the population in California is white, the rest is non-white. That means that California is overwhelmingly non-white. And so that does then mean that, the norm is should be a composition that is reflective of that diversity. And then so the need for affirmative action might itself be problematic. But I think that social progress is gradual and slow and incremental. And the idea behind affirmative action is that even if that is the composition of the state, decades and generations of injustice need to be corrected quickly, and therefore affirmative action can be used as a mechanism for correcting some of the imbalances. And so I think that there are a variety of considerations, but your point is exactly right, which is that there's a lot of work to be done. Carla agrees. Evan says, these propositions are not easy to get rid of either. They are enshrined in the state constitution. Touche. Arturo says, like Prop 22 cannot be reversed unless 6/7 of the legislature votes for it. Yeah, the supermajority requirements are absolutely insane. There's never a majority like that. And if there is, it's because there's been some funny business going on, and maybe the election wasn't quite fair. All right, everybody. So we're going to pick up where we left off. And as always, you're very engaged, and it's difficult to kind of segue into this, because I want to continue discussing the election in California, where I lived for 8 years before I moved to New York, and where I always have fun and where I have many friends. I love the place. But let's leave California and leave New York and enter the world of democracy and democratic backsliding, that really troubling, gloomy world where democracies fail and turn back into authoritarian regimes. We've talked about the different ways of conceptualizing backsliding. We've talked about how executive abuses increasingly take center stage, military coups are on the way out. We talked about how increasingly democracies fail from the inside. They undergo a process of legal decay carried out by executives and parties who seek to use the institutions of democracy to dismantle democracy. And the question, what causes this backsliding, inevitably comes up. And this is the million-dollar question, because as you know, we are very close to entering a third wave of de-democratization, a third reversal of democracy. This is a process that has involved the failure of as many as 12 or 13 democracies in the last 15 years. Why did these democracies fail? What caused them to break down? We really have three models that purport to explain why these democracies fail. This is relatively new research. The failures since 2006 are not very well documented in many cases. And the data in our understanding largely comes from analyses conducted during the period, on data from the period 1980 to about 2006. And so this is about the period that we'll be dealing with today, or 2008, pardon me. And the three models that have been used to examine this period we'll refer to as the following. The first model is the elite reaction model. And this comes from the sort of social forces literature. We're familiar with that approach, and we'll talk about that more momentarily. There's what's called the weak democracy syndrome model, which talks about the institutional weaknesses of democracies and how those weaknesses predispose democracies to executive abuses or military coups. We'll talk about the populist reversion model. And this is where would-be dictators mobilize the support of masses who are aggrieved about the failure of democratic governments to address their needs. And these would-be dictators mobilize that support to dismantle institutions of democracy and impose authoritarianism. These are three different models, all of which make different assumptions and emphasize different factors. The first model is the elite reaction model. And this is all about elites who seek to defend their material interests from redistributive policies. The idea here is that all societies have their elites, the ones who tower above everyone else and who own and control the means of production and who really benefit the most from economic activity. The idea here is that these elites become anxious about their material interests and their survival when governments pursue redistributive policies that involve, for example, taxing the rich to give to the poor, or when social movements pressure governments to do so. The idea is that when inequality is higher, these elites are especially likely to become concerned and especially likely to overthrow democracy. Now, this is very consistent with the sort of economic approach, but it's also consistent with the social forces approach because of the role of inequality and the role of social movements and different classes and different interests. Now, this book we've talked about before does relate relatively closely to this model, the simple idea being that inequality is a factor and that elite anxiety motivates these regime changes. Let's give you an example of an elite reaction reversion. This is the classic example. And some of you out there I know are very interested in Chile. It's likely that I'm preaching to the choir when I discuss this example. But for those of you who don't know as much about it, consider how closely this example connects to that description I just gave you of an elite-driven democratic reversal. So if you went to Chile in 1973, you would find yourself ensconced in turmoil. At that time, the socialist Salvador Allende government, which was democratically elected, was nationalizing industries, and expropriation was taking place, the transfer of ownership from the private sector to the state. And this was imposing heavy losses on Chile's ruling classes, the upper classes, the elites. And those elites lobbied their allies in the National Party, which had a fairly large constituency in the legislature. The Christian Democrats allied with the National Party, and the Chamber of Deputies, which was together controlled by the National Party and the Christian Democrats, accused Allende of not publishing changes which they had already approved that would have stopped his nationalizations. And they actually went so far as to call on the military to enforce order. And so what began as elite grievances turned into the Chamber of Deputies calling on the military to intervene and reestablish constitutional order to protect the interests of those elites. And on September 11th of that year, the military did exactly that. They ousted Allende, they bombed the palace, pictured here, and they took power. This is a classic example of an elite reaction reversion. You've got the elites who suffer because of redistributive policies, who then mobilize the support within political parties that they enjoy. Those parties then use institutions of government to call on the military to enforce order. The military, in turn, carries out a coup d'etat, stages a coup d'etat, and takes power for themselves. They stayed in power until 1990. Now, this disruption came after as many as 70 years of continuous democratic rule in Chile. And it was a disruption that was very exceptional because of that long democratic history. The second model is the weak democracy syndrome model. And in this model, reversions result from something very, very different. They come from institutional and political features of the regime or weaknesses of the regime that leave the regime vulnerable to military coups, to executives abusing their power, to poor economic performance, weakening the regime or causing intra-regime splits. All of these different threats can result from a variety of different institutional and political weaknesses or sort of frailties, if you will, that open up the democratic regime to collapse. And the events that often precipitate this collapse might include intra-elite conflicts that stem from poor economic performance that require everyone to tighten their belts. It might come from generalized public disaffection with government performance. This might be connected to the failure of the government to manage the economy. It might come from the failure of the government to adequately respond to societal demands. These events combine with these weaknesses to contribute to the overthrow of democracy, according to this theory. This theory then has really three components, and we'll look more closely at them before we continue. The first one we'll think of in terms of Praetorianism, and this relates to an absence of effective civilian control of the military. As you know, any new democracy has to establish civilian control of the military because the military has the guns and they have a monopoly on information, expertise, organization, and violence. And that means then that they can throw any government from power and they can establish a dictatorship if they want to. Now, the militaries in democracies who remain capable of doing this are often very, very powerful. They have a presence in decision-making bodies. They control their own budget. They control the appointment process within the military. They control state assets and streams of income that are outside of civilian control. They've got a variety of different features of their organization that give them a leg up in their relationship with the civilian government, and that makes them quite powerful. There's also the second component, which is institutionalization, and this relates to essentially whether or not the key democratic actors agree on the rules of the game. And so, for example, do incumbent governments concede if they lose re-election? Do they leave power if they lose re-election? Do they agree that the Constitution requires them leaving power, or do they challenge the basis of those rules and those expectations? The third one is underperformance, and this relates to economic crises. Economic crises are always destructive. They can cause elite defections. Elites within the regime feel the heat turning up. They feel they feel the wall's closing in on them. They begin to bicker about who should get what when there's less to go around. And ultimately, defections from within the regime can weaken the regime and cause the collapse of the democracy. Public dissatisfaction is also quite common because obviously the economy affects not just the regime, but also the society. The society loses faith in the government. And then, of course, there's also the fact of the undermining of the loyalty of civil servants. Economic crises require civil servants to accept less, and their loyalty is often brought into doubt when they have to accept less in more difficult circumstances. All of these different factors can contribute to this kind of weakening of democracy that the weak democracy syndrome sees as driving the collapse of these different democracies. Let's watch an example of a weak democracy reversion. This is the example of Thailand from 2014.
Yeah, I know, right here, you know. Mine.
2 days ago, the army announced martial law across all of Thailand and insisted it was not a coup d'etat. Today, they dropped all pretense and announced a coup d'etat. The day's events started with peace negotiations, which were held at the Army Club but quickly collapsed and resulted in the arrest of protest leaders from both sides. They then told the PDRC and red shirts to clear their camps and go home. PDRC left on their own accord while the red shirts were forced out by soldiers. From there, the army suspended the constitution, shut down all television stations, imposed a curfew, and took full control of the country.
คณะรักษาความสงบแห่งชาติซึ่งประกอบด้วยกองทัพบกกองบัญชาการกองทัพไทยกองทัพเรือกองทัพอากาศและสำนักงานตำรวจแห่งชาติจึงมีความจำเป็นต้องเข้าควบคุมอำนาจในการปกครองประเทศตั้งแต่วันที่ 22
Anti-government PDRC spared the army's heavy hand and allowed to break down their own site on their own terms.
ต้นใจผมก็อยากให้พวกผมมาในแนวนี้ผมก็คือว่ารักแผ่นดินรักประเทศชาติเพราะว่าทางเสื้อแดงเขาเดินในทางที่ผิดผมก็อยากให้ปฏิบัติเสื้อแดงออกไป
It's not clear what the coup means for the PDRC. They may have got their wish for the government to be overthrown. To suit that, the other senior leaders were arrested, and the armies made no indication of what they'll do next. Though their supporters were ecstatic at the news of a military coup, it appears as though the PDRC's days have now been numbered and their organization disbanded. Last night at 1 a.m., the army issued an order for ex-Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra to report to them this morning. The last time the army called for a meeting, which was yesterday, resulted in the arrest of all of their 10 gates. It's a total mob scene here outside the Army Club. Every time a car comes up, the press is just on top of it in a second. No one has any idea it was in tinted out window car. Recently ousted Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra has just arrived 2 hours late for a meeting with the army. The question now is, will she be able to leave? She reported at noon, was detained, along with her sister and brother-in-law, who were then all transferred to an army base 2 hours outside of the capital.
So we've seen smaller anti-coup protests earlier today, but nothing of this scale. Hundreds of people have showed up to express their anger at the army.
Among the junta's new restrictions on society are bans on the gathering of more than 5 people in public places and any speech that criticizes the coup d'etat or the army.
การเมืองมันเหมือนกับทหารเขามี มีการบิ้วอารมณ์แล้วก็อยู่เบื้องหลังมาตลอดในการสร้างสถานการณ์ให้มาถึงจุดนี้ที่การประกาศโปรแกรมคือเราเนี่ยเป็นเพราะว่าเป็นประชาชนที่ไม่เห็นด้วยกับการประกาศโปรแกรมศึกไม่เห็นด้วยกับการที่ทหารเข้ามายุ่งเกี่ยวกับการเมืองไม่เห็นด้วยเนี่ยมันต้องมีการแสดงออกนะเราก็นัดกันแบบ
A couple hundred people defied those bans and took to one of Bangkok's busiest intersections to voice their anger at the army and demand elections.
So we've just heard a rumor that the army has set a time limit for the anti-coup protesters to disperse, otherwise they'll disperse them themselves. We've just seen 2 anti-coup protesters arrested. The army's moved forward. Now they're retreating, but things are still very tense.
Okay. No take photo. No take photo.
General Prayuth has declared himself prime minister and suspended the constitution. Border crossings with Laos and Cambodia have been closed, and the army's banned at least 155 politicians and activists from leaving the country. The numbers aren't clear, but it seems at least some 100 political figures from both sides have already been detained by the army. It's not yet clear what the army's endgame is. Some insist this is a genuine attempt to restore stability to the country and lay the groundwork for future elections. All signs at the moment, however, point to something very different.
Let's watch one more video that goes into more detail and talks about the power of the military and the military's influence in Thailand and how that becomes a factor.
Over the past decades, squabbling politicians have become the trademark of Thai politics. The yellow shirts, supported by the elites, favour a form of guided democracy loyal to the monarchy. The red shirts, backer of political parties loyal to Thaksin Shinawatra, have won all the elections since 2001. But the most important political actor wears camo and black, the Thai Armed Forces. Its 1,600 generals are part of the old establishment that dominates the political space. But they are not allowed to participate in elections. Instead, they flex their muscles to oust political rivals. They staged coups in 2006 and 2014 to remove the Shinawatra family from power. Since then, they have had a go at reshaping Thailand's economic, political, and moral order. How did the Thai army become so powerful? Unlike other armies, Thailand's was not created to fight wars or defend the country's territorial integrity. Instead, it was primarily an internal army to be deployed for consolidation purposes within a loosely held realm. Over time, it came to fill the role of a bureaucracy. Partly because it has faced no external threat, it has become, and remains, the most important political force within Thailand. Thailand's army derives its legitimacy as a political actor from the monarch. Its primary duty is to protect the monarchy. The king is much revered and the army's sole source of legitimacy. Coups that replace elected government have become a legitimate part of the Thai political process. The current Prime Minister is the 29th since the abolition of absolute monarchy in 1932. Caught in a vicious cycle of coups, democratic institutions remain weak. The army's dominance has hindered their development. So what could change this? A bloody army crackdown could discredit the army, as happened following the Black May massacre in 1992. But whatever happens next, a new constitution, an election, it looks as if the army will retain its entrenched influence across Thai politics.
And so in Thailand, the military is a powerful actor. Thailand seems to fit the description of a weak democracy reversion, where democratic institutions are relatively weak, flaccid. The military, on the other hand, is very united, very strong, strong-willed, and with a long history of successful coups. Notice that in the video, the second video, there was talk about the division between the yellow shirts and the red shirts. That division within the civilian camp weakens the civilians and has held back the development of those civilian democratic institutions. Thailand seems to fit the model as an example of a weak democracy reversion. Very different than the situation in, say, Chile in 1973, where the elites themselves were in charge of sort of beginning that process of de-democratization. The military was involved in both cases, but the origin of the democratic collapse was different in Chile than in Thailand. In Chile, it had to do with the elites. In Thailand, it had to do with the initiative of the military itself. Now, the third type of reversion is a populist reversion. And the populist model emphasizes challengers to democratic rule who seize power by mobilizing dissatisfaction about the failure of democratic regimes to respond to the demands of lower class groups. So in any democratic society, working classes and lower classes issue demands for redistributive policies that will help them to improve their condition. This is a part of democracy. But in these situations, left-wing would-be dictators mobilize those grievances and really work with that set of demands to discredit existing institutions and sort of overtake the political system and install what is effectively a dictatorship. So what that means in turn is that these are always going to be left-wing dictatorships. They're not right-wing dictatorships like in the elite reaction model, where elite classes with intense material interests overthrow democracy to defend their interests. It's all about populist, lower class sort of support for leaders who will dismantle institutions in pursuit of creating a model that can really speak more to working class people. Now, the examples that come to mind when we talk about populist reversions in this model, well, yeah, Ecuador in 2007 and Venezuela in 2006 are often cited as examples. And I'll give you the example of Venezuela in 2006. The example of Venezuela is noteworthy because Hugo Chavez is perhaps the most iconic populist from the last 30 or 40 years, the third wave of democracy. In 2001, Chavez received unlimited decree powers via an enabling act. In subsequent years, he manipulated electoral law. He used public resources to fund campaigns. He abused control of the electoral management body. All the while, he exploited popular grievances, and he was able to mobilize huge public support. So for instance, this is a apartment block in a poor neighborhood in Caracas. I think it's the 23 de Enero neighborhood, if I'm not mistaken. And what you see up here is a vote for Chavez sign. And that really seems to symbolize and reflect the populist nature of the takeover in Venezuela. But what's noteworthy is that in Venezuela, this wasn't a takeover staged by the military. This was a process of legal erosion carried out by Chavez himself. And this process really got a leg up beginning in 2005 when the opposition boycotted the elections. They alleged irregularities, and Chavez's party was able to gain near monopoly control until 2010. And so the abuse of power, the mobilizing of populist support, all of this led up to what became near monopoly control of the assembly through 2010. And the story of Venezuela is really a populist story because the Socialist Party remains in power in Venezuela to this day, and the system has long since firmly transitioned to authoritarian rule. And it does appear to be, in every sense, a populist reversion. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at some data, and we're going to begin to assess these different cases and think about how well the different models fit the universe of different cases during the period from 1980 to 2008. So we'll look at the cases that we just talked about, minus the Chilean case, of course, because it came before 1980, but we'll look at a number of other cases as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the universe of cases of different moments of democratic backsliding according to two different data sets. The first one is the democracy dictatorship data set, which you're well aware of. It's the dichotomous measure that we learned about earlier in the course. And then we'll use the POLI 4 data set. And what's interesting is that these data sets captured in sort of code these cases differently, depending upon, of course, their characteristics. We know that the dichotomous coding regimes are authoritarian if they lack a competitively elected legislature and executive. And so what this means is that they do a good job capturing coups, this data set. The POLI 4 coding, remember, is continuous. So it spans from -10 to +10. And we know that in between are different gradations of democracy, hybrid regimes, and then authoritarian regimes. And so this data set captures incremental changes as well as coups. And so the total distribution of the types of cases is a little bit different in the POLI 4 data set when these are coded. And they were coded by the reading that we did for this week. Well, we did for this unit by Haggard and Kaufman. In those changes, those incremental changes, they can range from restrictions on regulation, competitiveness, the openness of executive recruitment, all the way to checks on executive discretion, like constraints on the judiciary or legislature, measures diluting liberties. So it's very, very, very flexible, and it's very sensitive to all sorts of little changes that the democracy dictatorship index is not. And so the first thing we're going to look at is the distribution of reversions in the democracy dictatorship data set. Now, the authors that we read went about the coding of these cases, the proximate cause of these different cases of democratic reversion. And what you see is we've got elite reaction reversions, a total of 6 of them in the democracy dictatorship data set during this period. We've got a total of 16 weak democracy reversions in this data set during this period. And we have a total of 3 populist reversions during this period. So this is interesting because this is our first look at sort of the universe of cases of collapse, democratic reversal during this period. And I want to ask you, what does this suggest about the generalizability of these 3 models that we have just reviewed and discussed examples of? For example, what does this say about the generalizability of the elite reaction model? What does it say about the generalizability of the weak democracy model? And then what does it say about the generalizability of the populist reversion model?
I think what it says about the populist reversion model is it's relatively rare, which makes sense because having figures who are good enough speakers and resonate enough with the people to take over a country is very difficult and very unique, as it should be. And it makes sense that weak democracies are the most common because as we endured the second wave of democracy, or the third wave of democratization in the 80s and 90s, it would make sense that not all democracies are created equal, and some democracies are weaker, and they have these reversions that occur. And then the elite reaction reversion is kind of in the middle. It's more common than populist reversions, but it's still significantly less common than weak democracy reversion.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. These populist reversions are not common. And that model does not appear to be very generalizable. It appears to be kind of specific to a few cases. And moreover, it appears to be specific to some cases that are not well known. So the Ecuador 2000 case, I know about that case well because I've written about it and published about it. But Ecuador is a country that not many people understand or know well. It's not a big country, right? It's not Brazil. It's not Thailand or Turkey. Suriname, similar situation. That's a country in Latin America that I don't know anything about. And maybe you do, but my point is that the model doesn't appear to be that generalizable. It appears to be relatively rare, and it appears to have occurred in some very specific cases. The weak democracy reversion model, on the other hand, appears to look pretty good. we see a lot of countries that transitioned during the third wave, and we see a lot of them that were probably always relatively unconsolidated and relatively weak, and sensitive to these kinds of frailties that might turn into larger and larger wounds and eventually overtake the entire organism, so to speak. It makes sense that in this context, that would be a common, in a very general pattern. And so consequently, we see a large number of those in this data set. The elite reaction reversion, on the other hand, it's more common than the populist reversion, but it's not as common as the weak democracy ones. And what that might suggest is that elites are less politically engaged as far as regime change is concerned than we thought. It might mean that inequality is less of a factor than we thought. Maybe it means inequality is relatively low in these other cases, but higher in these cases. Either way, this is also a model that doesn't appear to be as generalizable as, say, the weak democracy reversion model. And so when we look at this universe of cases categorized in this way, according to the sort of proximate cause, we see that not all these models are created equal. They sort of have a different relevance or a sort of different occurrence when we actually look out into the real world. Martin says, would you say that populism leads to the consolidation of power, such as Venezuela, or do elites use populism as a way to gain power? So in Venezuela and in Ecuador, populism was a way to consolidate power because both Rafael Correa and Hugo Chavez, both of them got their support primarily from working class and lower middle class people, not elites. And so those were left-wing dictatorships. Populism did help them to consolidate power because they could discredit existing institutions with all of that support from those lower classes that they had. Do elites use populism as a way to gain power? No, elites don't, because populism by its very nature is connected to popular material interests. And popular material interests are in direct conflict with the material interests of elites, who are a very narrow group in society. They're at the very top of society. And so they want to hold popular masses down with policies that are advantageous to the elites and bad for the masses. And so elites will not use, economic elites will not use populism. Instead, they will use the military, they will use maybe the other institutions of the state to carry out the overthrow of democracy and install right-wing dictators. And that's what we saw in Chile, but that's also what we see to a certain degree in Bolivia in 1980 and in Thailand in 2006 and so on. Now, we're going to mix it up a little bit. And I want to show you the distribution of reversions in the POLI data set. So this is using a different data set that codes things differently depending upon incremental changes. And you'll notice that a few things are a little bit different here. Not only are there more cases, but the distribution of the cases, and sometimes the cases themselves, are a little bit different. Now that's all very interesting, and it suggests that these data sets don't agree on some fundamental questions. But putting that aside for now, I want to ask you the same question. What does this suggest about the generalizability of these different models? Does it change what we previously said in any way? Does it make us more confident in some of the models than we were previously? Does it even out these models in some way? What do you think? Well, the first thing that we notice is that there are many more elite reaction reversions in this coding than in the previous one. Here there are 11. Previously there were 6. Now that means that maybe according to this data set, the elite reaction reversion is a more common type of reversion. Did someone want to comment? I hear a mic.
Yeah, I just wanted to say because that one was the DD and this one's polity, this could demonstrate the sort of nuance that polity would provide that's different from the DD measure. It allows for a better way to track the elite's presence in a democratic shift.
Absolutely. Yeah. In that sensitivity to those different kinds of changes means that ultimately the proximate causes in these cases, and in the cases that are even deemed relevant by the data set because of the coding, they're different as well. Now, some of the cases are the same. You'll notice, for example, that in both there is Ghana 1981 for a populist reversion. But for instance, Ecuador 2000 is a populist reversion in the DD data set, but not in polity. And so this is interesting because it means that there's disagreement based upon which data set we use and what kinds of questions we ask. Now, what it says, moreover, is that the weak democracy model, while still king, more or less, has to compete more with that elite reaction reversion. But generally speaking, what we see yet again is that there are very few populist reversions. It's just not common to see these leftist leaders impose authoritarian rule, through the mobilization of popular grievances with democratic governments. It's just not common. There aren't a lot of Hugo Chavez's. There aren't a lot of Rafael Correas. They just don't exist. But generally speaking, this does tell us that there's more to the story than we might discover if we use a single data set. What I told you from the beginning of class is that where we stand depends on where we sit, and that is also the case with data sets and the measures that we use to gauge democracy and authoritarianism. In this case, it's no different. All right, everybody, we're out of time. We don't have class on Wednesday. It's Veterans Day. So go out there and enjoy yourselves, join a parade, celebrate veterans in their sacrifices, but don't come to class because we're not going to have it. So thanks so much for being here. I hope that you enjoyed this. We will finish up what we have left, which is just a few slides next week. I think I probably will have to adjust the syllabus a little bit, but don't worry. I'll make sure that I send the new one to you. As a reminder, I did say at the beginning of class that since we have a reader now, the grading will pick up very soon and we'll be in good shape. But thank you again for all your patience, and sorry about the challenges. COVID really has the world turned upside down in a variety of ways. But thank you again for being here. So glad that we were able to discuss the election. Have a nice evening, and I'll see you next time.
Professor, so
Yes,
some
sir.
of these terms that you presented, such as the weak democracy syndrome components, were they from last week's reading or from this week's?
It's from last week's reading, but we haven't finished the unit yet. It's from Haggard and Kaufman. Since we
Okay.
we haven't finished the unit yet, so we're sort of still using that. We're a little bit behind.
Oh, okay, perfect. Then I'll have time to catch up on this week's readings.
For sure.
Alrighty, thank you.
No problem. See you, Karen. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. Have a great Veterans Day.